Introduction to the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is one of the darkest chapters in human history, representing the forced transatlantic voyage of enslaved Africans to the New World. This harrowing journey is a key component of the Atlantic slave trade, which spanned from the 16th to the 19th century. Understanding the Middle Passage is crucial to comprehending the full scope of the transatlantic slave trade and its profound impact on millions of lives. Overview of the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade, also known as the transatlantic slave trade, was a vast and brutal system of forced migration that brought millions of Africans to the Americas. This trade was driven by European colonial powers seeking labor for their plantations in the Caribbean, North America, and South America. The trade formed part of a larger triangular trade network, which included the shipment of goods from Europe to Africa, enslaved Africans to the Americas, and raw materials from the Americas back to Europe. The Middle Passage, specifically, refers to the second leg of this triangular trade. It was the journey that transported enslaved Africans from the West African coast to the New World. The conditions of this voyage were horrific, characterized by extreme overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and inhumane treatment. Definition and significance of the Middle Passage. The term Middle Passage highlights the centrality of this journey within the broader context of the slave trade. It was a middle leg, both geographically and temporally, in the triangular trade route. For the enslaved Africans, it was a passage into a life of unimaginable hardship and suffering. The Middle Passage is significant not only because of the immense suffering it caused, but also because of its enduring impact on African societies and the African diaspora. Objectives of the lecture series. In this lecture series, we aim to achieve several key objectives. To understand the historical context, we will explore the origins and development of the Atlantic slave trade, examining the economic, social, and political factors that drove European nations to participate in the trade. To examine the conditions of the Middle Passage, we will delve into the brutal realities of the Middle Passage, analyzing the inhumane conditions aboard slave ships, the diseases that ravaged the enslaved, and the sheer brutality of the journey. To explore the impact on enslaved individuals, we will look at the profound physical, psychological, and emotional toll the Middle Passage took on those who survived it. We will also consider the ways in which these individuals exhibited resilience and strength in the face of extreme adversity. To highlight acts of resistance and coping mechanisms, we will shed light on the various forms of resistance and coping strategies developed by enslaved Africans during the Middle Passage. This includes acts of defiance, cultural preservation, and support networks among the enslaved. To reflect on the legacy of the Middle Passage, finally, we will consider the long-term impact of the Middle Passage on the African diaspora and its role in shaping the collective memory and identity of African descendants in the Americas. The Middle Passage is a subject that evokes a range of emotions: anger, sorrow, and a deep sense of injustice. It is a testament to the capacity for human cruelty, but also to the resilience of the human spirit. By examining this period in detail, we hope to honor the memory of those who suffered and to understand the historical forces that continue to shape our world today. As we embark on this exploration, it is essential to approach the subject with the gravity and respect it deserves. The stories of those who endured the Middle Passage are not just historical footnotes, they are integral to understanding the complexities of our shared history. Through this series, we aim to illuminate these stories, ensuring they are remembered and acknowledged as we strive for a more just and equitable world. The origins of the slave trade. The origins of the Atlantic slave trade are deeply rooted in the economic, social, and political dynamics of the early modern world. To understand the brutal system of the Middle Passage, we must first examine the factors that led to the enslavement and forced migration of millions of Africans. Historical context of the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade began in the early 15th century as European nations expanded their empires and explored new territories. Initially, European contact with Africa was focused on trade in goods such as gold, ivory, and spices. However, the discovery of the New World and the establishment of plantations in the Caribbean, South America, and North America created a massive demand for labor. Indigenous populations in these regions were decimated by disease and warfare, making them an unreliable source of labor. Europeans turned to Africa to fill this labor void. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to engage in the transatlantic slave trade, transporting enslaved Africans to work on sugar plantations on the islands of Madeira and São Tomé. By the early 16th century, the Spanish, Dutch, English, and French had joined the trade, establishing a vast network of trade routes that linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The trade became a cornerstone of European colonial economies, with enslaved Africans providing the labor necessary for the production of cash crops such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. Key players: European colonizers and African traders. The transatlantic slave trade involved complex interactions between European colonizers and African societies. European traders relied on African intermediaries to supply them with enslaved individuals. African rulers and merchants played a crucial role in the trade, capturing and selling fellow Africans to European traders in exchange for goods such as guns, textiles, and alcohol. The involvement of African societies in the slave trade was driven by a combination of factors, including economic incentives and political considerations. Some African rulers saw the trade as a way to consolidate power and gain wealth. Others were coerced or compelled by the threat of European military force. The trade led to significant social disruption within African societies, as communities were raided, families were torn apart, and traditional social structures were destabilized. Initial capture and sale of enslaved Africans. The process of capturing and enslaving Africans was brutal and dehumanizing. Enslaved individuals were often captured during wars or raids orchestrated by African traders or rival groups. They were forcibly marched to coastal forts and trading posts, enduring harsh conditions and brutal treatment along the way. Many did not survive these initial stages of enslavement. Once at the coast, enslaved Africans were held in holding pens or forts until they could be sold to European traders. These forts, such as Elmina Castle in present-day Ghana and Gorée Island off the coast of Senegal, became infamous for their inhumane conditions. Enslaved individuals were subjected to overcrowding, malnutrition, and abuse while awaiting shipment to the New World. The sale of enslaved Africans to European traders was conducted through a barter system. Europeans exchanged goods such as guns, metalware, and cloth for human lives. The enslaved were then branded with hot irons to mark them as property of their European buyers. This branding was not only physically painful but also symbolically significant, representing the complete loss of autonomy and identity for the enslaved individuals. Conclusion: the origins of the transatlantic slave trade reveal a complex interplay of economic motivations, political dynamics, and social disruptions. European colonizers sought to exploit the labor of enslaved Africans to fuel their colonial enterprises, while African societies became entangled in the trade through a combination of coercion, complicity, and resistance. The initial capture and sale of enslaved Africans set the stage for the horrors of the Middle Passage and the subsequent brutalities of slavery in the Americas. Understanding these origins is crucial for comprehending the full impact of the transatlantic slave trade. It highlights the extensive networks of exploitation and the profound human suffering that underpinned the development of the modern world. As we delve deeper into the specifics of the Middle Passage, this context will help us appreciate the enduring legacies of this tragic chapter in history. The journey begins. Departure from Africa. The departure from Africa marks the beginning of one of the most harrowing segments of the transatlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage. This phase involved the initial capture of Africans, their forced march to the coast, and the brutal conditions they faced at coastal forts and slave markets before boarding the ships. Understanding these initial stages is crucial to comprehending the full extent of the suffering endured by enslaved Africans. Conditions at coastal forts and slave markets. The journey to the Americas began long before the enslaved individuals set foot on the ships. After capture, often during violent raids or wars orchestrated by rival groups or traders, the captured Africans were forced to march vast distances to the coast. These marches, known as coffles, were grueling and inhumane. Captives were often chained together, and those who were unable to keep up were left to die. The physical and psychological toll of these marches was immense, with many captives suffering from exhaustion, starvation, and abuse. Upon reaching the coast, the enslaved Africans were confined in holding pens, forts, or dungeons. These facilities, such as Elmina Castle in Ghana or Bunce Island in Sierra Leone, were overcrowded and unsanitary. The conditions within these forts were abysmal: cramped quarters, insufficient ventilation, and a lack of adequate food and water. Disease spread rapidly in these environments, claiming many lives before the captives even saw the ships that would take them across the Atlantic. The experience in these holding facilities was one of dehumanization and terror. Enslaved individuals were treated as commodities, with no regard for their humanity. They were inspected, branded, and sorted based on their perceived value. Families were often torn apart, with members sold to different traders. The trauma of separation and the brutal conditions set the stage for the horrors of the Middle Passage. Forced marches to the coast. The forced marches to the coast were a critical and devastating part of the journey for enslaved Africans. These marches could last weeks or even months, covering hundreds of miles. The captives, often shackled together in coffles, were driven by armed traders. The physical strain of these marches was enormous, with captives suffering from malnutrition, dehydration, and exposure to the elements. The psychological impact of these marches was equally profound. Enslaved individuals were torn from their homes and communities, with little understanding of what awaited them. The trauma of capture, combined with the harsh conditions of the march, broke the spirits of many. Yet, even in these dire circumstances, acts of resistance and solidarity emerged. Some captives attempted to escape, while others provided support to their fellow captives, sharing whatever resources they had. Initial stages of enslavement and dehumanization. The initial stages of enslavement involved a systematic process of dehumanization. Upon arrival at the coast, captives were subjected to further brutal treatment. They were often stripped of their clothing, branded with hot irons, and forced into cramped holding facilities. The branding process was particularly traumatic, as it symbolized the complete loss of autonomy and identity. Enslaved individuals were marked as property, their humanity reduced to a mere commodity. The physical conditions in the holding facilities were appalling. Overcrowding, lack of sanitation, and inadequate food and water created a breeding ground for disease. Many captives succumbed to illnesses such as dysentery, smallpox, and malaria. Those who survived faced the constant threat of violence and abuse from their captors. Despite these conditions, enslaved Africans displayed remarkable resilience. They formed bonds of solidarity, supporting each other through the darkest moments. Cultural practices such as singing, dancing, and storytelling provided a sense of continuity and hope. These acts of resistance and cultural preservation were crucial in maintaining a sense of identity and humanity amidst the dehumanization. Conclusion. The departure from Africa and the initial stages of the journey were characterized by extreme brutality and dehumanization. The forced marches, the conditions in coastal forts, and the initial stages of enslavement revealed the systematic cruelty of the transatlantic slave trade. Understanding these early stages is essential for grasping the full horror of the Middle Passage and the resilience of those who endured it. As we continue our exploration, we will delve deeper into the experiences of enslaved Africans during the Middle Passage, examining the specific conditions on the ships and the strategies of resistance and survival employed by the captives. This context of departure and initial enslavement provides a crucial foundation for understanding the immense suffering and remarkable resilience of those who endured the Middle Passage. The brutal realities of the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage, the journey from the African coast to the Americas, epitomizes the extreme brutality of the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans faced unimaginable horrors during this leg of their journey, enduring inhumane conditions aboard slave ships that were designed to maximize profit at the expense of human dignity and life. Layout and structure of slave ships. Slave ships were specially outfitted to transport as many enslaved individuals as possible, often at the expense of their health and well-being. The ships were divided into several cramped and dark compartments below deck, where enslaved Africans were packed tightly together. The main hold, where most captives were kept, had a ceiling so low that sitting upright was often impossible. Wooden platforms, or shelves, were installed to create additional levels, allowing traders to cram even more people into the limited space. The captives were shackled together in pairs, and their movements were severely restricted. Men were typically kept separate from women and children, who were often placed in slightly less confined areas, but were equally vulnerable to abuse. The overcrowded conditions meant that each person had only about 4 to 5 square feet of space, insufficient for movement or comfort. This extreme confinement led to numerous physical and psychological problems. Overcrowding and confinement below deck. The overcrowding on slave ships was a deliberate tactic to maximize profits. The more captives a ship could carry, the greater the potential financial gain for the traders. However, this overcrowding came with severe consequences. The lack of space meant that enslaved Africans were forced to lie side by side, unable to move freely. This led to a range of health issues, including sores and infections caused by prolonged immobility and friction. Sanitation was virtually non-existent. Buckets, used as latrines, were often inadequate for the number of people on board, leading to filth and stench that permeated the ship. The combination of close quarters, poor sanitation, and limited ventilation created a breeding ground for diseases. Dysentery, smallpox, and other contagious diseases spread rapidly, decimating the captive population. It is estimated that mortality rates during the Middle Passage ranged from 15% to 25%, with some voyages experiencing even higher losses. Lack of sanitation, food, and water. The conditions of the Middle Passage were exacerbated by the lack of adequate food and water. Enslaved Africans were given minimal rations, typically consisting of a meager amount of rice, beans, or yams. The food was often spoiled and unfit for consumption. Water was equally scarce, and dehydration was a constant threat. Malnutrition and dehydration weakened the captives, making them more susceptible to disease. The lack of sanitation meant that the hold of the ship quickly became a cesspit. The stench of bodily fluids, combined with the heat and humidity, created an unbearable environment. The spread of disease was inevitable under these conditions, and many captives died from illnesses that could have been prevented with basic hygiene and medical care. Inhumane treatment and violence. The physical conditions on slave ships were compounded by the violent and dehumanizing treatment inflicted by the crew. Enslaved Africans were subjected to constant abuse, including beatings, whippings, and sexual assault. Any sign of resistance or noncompliance was met with brutal punishment. The crew used these methods to maintain control and instill fear among the captives. The psychological impact of this treatment was profound. Enslaved Africans faced constant terror and uncertainty, not knowing if they would survive the journey or what awaited them at its end. The trauma of the Middle Passage left deep scars, both physical and emotional, that would affect survivors for the rest of their lives. Conclusion. The brutal realities of the Middle Passage are a testament to the depths of human cruelty and the inhumanity of the transatlantic slave trade. The layout and structure of the slave ships, the overcrowding and lack of sanitation, and the inhumane treatment all contributed to a journey of unimaginable suffering. Despite these conditions, many enslaved Africans exhibited remarkable resilience, finding ways to cope and survive in the face of extreme adversity. As we move forward in our exploration, we will examine the impact of the Middle Passage on the enslaved individuals who endured it. We will consider the physical and psychological toll of the journey and the ways in which these individuals resisted and coped with their circumstances. Understanding the brutal realities of the Middle Passage is essential to appreciating the strength and resilience of those who survived this horrific chapter in history. Disease and mortality on slave ships. The Middle Passage was not only characterized by inhumane treatment and brutal conditions, but also by the rampant spread of disease and high mortality rates among enslaved Africans. The confined and unsanitary environment of slave ships created a perfect breeding ground for various illnesses, resulting in a significant loss of life during the transatlantic journey. This part explores the diseases that plagued the ships, their impact on the captives, and the ways in which these conditions contributed to the overall horror of the Middle Passage. Common diseases and their spread. The unsanitary conditions aboard slave ships made it almost inevitable that disease would spread quickly and lethally. Some of the most common diseases included dysentery, smallpox, and malaria. Dysentery, caused by poor hygiene and contaminated food and water, was particularly rampant. The cramped quarters and lack of proper sanitation meant that waste was not effectively disposed of, leading to widespread infection. Symptoms included severe diarrhea, dehydration, and extreme abdominal pain, all of which contributed to a high mortality rate. Smallpox, a highly contagious and deadly disease, also spread rapidly in the confined spaces of the slave ships. The close proximity of captives, combined with poor ventilation, facilitated the transmission of the virus. Smallpox caused high fever, severe body aches, and a characteristic rash that could lead to scarring or death. Malaria, spread by mosquitoes, was another common ailment. Though more prevalent in tropical climates, the disease could persist in shipboard conditions, causing fever, chills, and severe fatigue. Other diseases such as scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C and respiratory infections, exacerbated by poor air quality and overcrowding, also took a heavy toll. The overall health of the captives was severely compromised by malnutrition and dehydration, making them more susceptible to illness. Impact of malnutrition and dehydration. The lack of adequate nutrition and clean water on slave ships compounded the effects of disease. Enslaved Africans were provided with minimal rations that were often insufficient to meet their basic nutritional needs. The food, which typically consisted of rice, beans, and yams, was often of poor quality and spoiled. This inadequate diet led to malnutrition, weakening the captives' immune systems and making them more vulnerable to infection. Dehydration was another critical issue. Fresh water was scarce, and captives were given only small amounts to drink. The combination of dehydration and heat exacerbated the effects of diseases like dysentery, leading to rapid physical decline. The resulting weakness and exhaustion left many captives unable to move or even sit up, further increasing their risk of death. Mortality rates and burial practices at sea. The mortality rates during the Middle Passage were staggering. It is estimated that between 15% and 25% of enslaved Africans died during the journey. On some voyages, the death toll was even higher, with entire shiploads of captives perishing before reaching the Americas. The high mortality rates were a direct result of the brutal conditions, rampant disease, and inadequate food and water. When captives died aboard the ships, their bodies were typically thrown overboard. This practice, known as burial at sea, was both a practical and symbolic act. Practically, it helped to prevent the spread of disease among the living. Symbolically, it represented the ultimate dehumanization of the captives, reducing their lives to mere cargo. The act of throwing bodies into the ocean was a grim reminder of the callous disregard for human life that characterized the slave trade. Conclusion: the spread of disease and the resulting high mortality rates are central to understanding the horrors of the Middle Passage. The unsanitary conditions, lack of nutrition and clean water, and the overall brutality of the journey created a perfect storm for the spread of illness. Enslaved Africans faced not only the physical and psychological torment of their captivity, but also the constant threat of death from disease. These conditions highlight the extreme cruelty of the transatlantic slave trade and the immense suffering endured by those who were forced into it. As we continue to explore the impact of the Middle Passage, it is essential to remember the human cost of this tragic chapter in history and to honor the resilience of those who survived it. The high mortality rates and the practice of burial at sea serve as stark reminders of the need to confront and remember the atrocities of the past. Psychological and emotional trauma. The Middle Passage was not only a physical ordeal but also a profoundly traumatic psychological and emotional experience for the enslaved Africans. The horrors they faced went beyond physical suffering, embedding deep emotional scars that would affect individuals and their descendants for generations. Understanding the psychological impact of the Middle Passage is crucial to comprehending the full scope of its brutality and the resilience of those who survived it. The psychological impact of the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage inflicted severe psychological trauma on enslaved Africans. The journey began with the violent disruption of their lives through capture and forced marches to the coast, where they were held in horrendous conditions before boarding the ships. The initial trauma of capture, which often involved the violent separation from family and community, left deep emotional wounds. Enslaved individuals were stripped of their homes, their identities, and their sense of security. Once aboard the ships, the conditions only worsened. The constant threat of violence from the crew, the lack of privacy, and the forced proximity to other captives created an environment of perpetual fear and anxiety. The daily reality of witnessing or experiencing beatings, sexual abuse, and death fostered a state of chronic stress and trauma. Separation from family and community. One of the most devastating aspects of the Middle Passage was the forced separation from family and community. Enslaved individuals were often taken far from their home regions, with no possibility of reunion with their loved ones. This separation severed the social and cultural ties that had provided them with support and identity. The loss of family was particularly traumatic for children and young people who were deprived of parental care and guidance. The communal bonds that had been integral to their lives were shattered, leaving individuals isolated and vulnerable. This isolation compounded the psychological trauma as enslaved Africans struggled to cope with the loss of their social networks. Despite these challenges, many captives sought to recreate these bonds with fellow enslaved individuals, forming new communities of solidarity and support. Coping mechanisms and acts of resistance. In the face of unimaginable suffering, enslaved Africans developed various coping mechanisms and forms of resistance to maintain their sense of identity and humanity. These strategies were crucial for their psychological survival and demonstrated remarkable resilience. Cultural preservation. One of the primary ways enslaved Africans coped with their circumstances was through the preservation of their cultural practices. Music, dance, and oral storytelling were essential aspects of African cultures that provided solace and a sense of continuity. Songs and rhythms from their homelands were adapted to their new, harsh reality, helping them maintain a connection to their heritage. Spiritual practices. Religion and spirituality also played a significant role in helping captives endure the horrors of the Middle Passage. Enslaved Africans brought with them various religious beliefs and practices, which provided comfort and hope. Prayer, ritual, and spiritual ceremonies were acts of resistance against the dehumanizing conditions of their captivity. Solidarity and mutual support. The bonds of solidarity formed among the captives were vital for their survival. Enslaved Africans supported one another through acts of kindness, sharing scarce resources, and offering emotional support. These new communities provided a buffer against the psychological assault of their circumstances. Acts of defiance. Resistance also took the form of defiance against their captors. Some enslaved individuals engaged in passive resistance, such as refusing to eat or work, while others planned and executed revolts. These acts of defiance, though often met with brutal retaliation, were expressions of their unbroken spirit and desire for freedom. Long-term psychological effects. The psychological trauma of the Middle Passage did not end with the journey itself. The scars left by this experience persisted long after arrival in the Americas, affecting the mental health of survivors and their descendants. The trauma of enslavement, compounded by continued exploitation and abuse in the New World, led to long-term emotional and psychological distress. The legacy of this trauma is evident in the collective memory of the African diaspora. The stories of the Middle Passage have been passed down through generations, serving as a testament to the resilience and strength of those who endured it. This shared history has shaped the cultural identity of African-descended communities, reminding them of their ancestors' suffering and perseverance. Conclusion. The psychological and emotional trauma of the Middle Passage underscores the depth of suffering endured by enslaved Africans. The combination of physical brutality, separation from loved ones, and dehumanizing treatment created a profound and lasting impact on their mental health. Despite these immense challenges, the resilience and strength displayed by those who survived the Middle Passage are a testament to the indomitable human spirit. Understanding the psychological impact of the Middle Passage is essential for fully appreciating the atrocities of the transatlantic slave trade and honoring the memory of those who endured it. As we continue to explore this dark chapter in history, it is crucial to recognize the enduring legacy of this trauma and the remarkable resilience of the African diaspora. Acts of resistance and rebellion. Despite the overwhelming brutality and dehumanization of the Middle Passage, enslaved Africans exhibited remarkable resilience and courage. Acts of resistance and rebellion were not uncommon, reflecting the indomitable spirit of those who refused to accept their fate passively. This part delves into the various forms of resistance that occurred during the Middle Passage, highlighting the bravery and solidarity of the captives. Forms of resistance. Resistance on the slave ships took many forms, ranging from subtle acts of defiance to full-scale rebellions. These acts of resistance were expressions of the captives' refusal to be broken by their circumstances and their determination to reclaim some measure of control over their lives. Passive resistance. One of the most common forms of resistance was passive defiance. Enslaved Africans often refused to eat, risking their health and lives rather than submitting to their captors' control. Hunger strikes were a way to assert their autonomy and reject the conditions imposed upon them. This form of resistance was particularly challenging for the crew, as it undermined their authority and could lead to the death of valuable cargo. Cultural resistance. Maintaining cultural practices was another powerful form of resistance. Enslaved individuals continued to practice their traditional songs, dances, and rituals, despite the oppressive conditions. These cultural expressions were acts of defiance that preserved their identities and provided emotional and psychological relief. Through storytelling and music, they kept their heritage alive and forged a sense of community among the captives. Sabotage. Acts of sabotage were also common. Enslaved Africans might damage the ship's equipment, tamper with supplies, or find ways to disrupt daily operations. These acts of sabotage, though often small and covert, collectively weakened the control of the crew and created an atmosphere of unrest and defiance. Rebellions on slave ships. While passive resistance and sabotage were significant, the most dramatic acts of defiance were outright rebellions. These uprisings were perilous and often led to brutal reprisals, but they were powerful demonstrations of the captives' yearning for freedom. Planning and execution. Rebellions required meticulous planning and coordination among the captives. Communication was challenging due to language barriers and constant surveillance, but enslaved Africans found ways to organize and plan their uprisings. They used whispered conversations, signals, and coded messages to coordinate their actions. Examples of rebellions. Numerous shipboard rebellions are recorded in the history of the Middle Passage. One notable example is the revolt aboard the ship Amistad in 1839, where a group of enslaved Africans, led by Sengbe P., also known as Joseph Sink, successfully took control of the ship. Although this rebellion occurred after the legal abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, it symbolizes the enduring spirit of resistance. Another significant rebellion took place on the ship Little George in 1730. Enslaved Africans aboard the ship overpowered the crew, took control, and attempted to navigate back to Africa. Although the rebellion was ultimately suppressed, it demonstrated the captives' relentless pursuit of freedom. Consequences of rebellion. The consequences of rebellion were severe. When rebellions were quashed, the leaders and participants faced brutal punishments, including torture, execution, and being thrown overboard. These retaliatory measures were intended to instill fear and deter further acts of resistance. However, the threat of brutal punishment did not always prevent uprisings, as the desire for freedom often outweighed the fear of retribution. Rebellions also had significant implications for the slave trade. They increased the risks and costs for traders and ship owners, who had to invest in additional security measures and face potential financial losses from damaged ships or lost cargo. The persistent threat of rebellion highlighted the inherent instability and inhumanity of the slave trade, contributing to the growing abolitionist sentiment in later years. Conclusion. Acts of resistance and rebellion during the Middle Passage were profound expressions of the human spirit's resilience and determination. Despite facing unimaginable cruelty and dehumanization, enslaved Africans found ways to assert their autonomy and fight for their freedom. These acts of defiance, whether through passive resistance, cultural preservation, sabotage, or outright rebellion, underscore the captives' courage and enduring hope. Understanding these acts of resistance is essential to appreciating the full scope of the Middle Passage's history. It is a testament to the indomitable will of those who endured the journey and a reminder of the human capacity for resistance and resilience in the face of extreme oppression. As we continue to explore the legacy of the Middle Passage, honoring these acts of resistance is crucial to acknowledging the strength and dignity of those who suffered through it. Arrival and initial experience in the Americas. After enduring the horrific conditions of the Middle Passage, enslaved Africans faced a new set of challenges upon their arrival in the Americas. This part examines the initial experiences of these individuals as they disembarked from the slave ships, the process of being sold into slavery, and the immediate impact on their lives and identities. Disembarkation and inspection. Upon arrival in the Americas, enslaved Africans were often in a weakened and traumatized state. Disembarkation was a grueling process, as captives were forced to leave the confined quarters of the ship, often after months at sea, and enter an unfamiliar and hostile environment. They were typically taken to holding areas, sometimes referred to as slave pens or barracuns, where they would be inspected and prepared for sale. The inspection process was dehumanizing and brutal. Enslaved individuals were stripped of their clothing and subjected to thorough examinations by potential buyers. These inspections assessed their physical condition, health, and perceived strength and suitability for labor. Buyers looked for signs of disease, injury, or any physical imperfection that might reduce the enslaved person's value. The captives were treated as commodities, their bodies scrutinized and appraised like livestock. The auction block and sale. Following inspection, the captives were taken to slave markets, where they would be sold to the highest bidder. The auction block was one of the most traumatic experiences for enslaved Africans, as it marked the moment when they were officially commodified and stripped of their humanity. Families who had managed to stay together during the Middle Passage were often separated at this point, as buyers rarely purchased entire family units. This separation added another layer of trauma, as loved ones were torn apart, often never to see each other again. The auction process was a public spectacle, attracting crowds of buyers who examined the captives and bid on them. The auctioneer would call out descriptions of the enslaved individuals, highlighting their physical attributes and potential for labor. Enslaved Africans were sold to various types of buyers, including plantation owners, industrialists, and householders. The destinations varied, but the underlying purpose was the same: to exploit their labor for economic gain. Initial adjustment to slavery. Once sold, enslaved Africans faced the daunting task of adjusting to their new lives under slavery. They were transported to plantations, mines, factories, or homes where they would begin their forced labor. The transition was harsh and disorienting, as they had to adapt to new environments, languages, and cultures while enduring the constant threat of violence and punishment. For many, the initial period of enslavement was marked by intense physical labor, often under brutal conditions. Plantation life, for instance, involved grueling work from dawn until dusk, with tasks ranging from planting and harvesting crops to maintaining the land and facilities. The work was exhausting and relentless, with little respite or opportunity for rest. Loss of identity and cultural erasure. The arrival in the Americas also signaled the beginning of a systematic attempt to erase the cultural identities of enslaved Africans. Slaveholders sought to suppress African cultural practices, languages, and traditions, aiming to break the spirit of the captives and mold them into compliant laborers. This cultural erasure was a deliberate strategy to prevent rebellion and resistance by severing ties to their heritage and community. Despite these efforts, enslaved Africans found ways to preserve their cultural identities. They adapted their traditions to the new environment, creating syncretic practices that blended African and New World elements. Music, dance, religion, and oral traditions became vital means of cultural preservation and resistance, providing a sense of continuity and resilience in the face of oppression. Psychological impact and trauma. The psychological impact of the transition to slavery was profound. Enslaved Africans grappled with feelings of loss, grief, and despair as they navigated their new realities. The trauma of the Middle Passage, compounded by the brutalities of enslavement, left deep emotional scars. However, the resilience and strength of these individuals were remarkable. They found ways to build new communities, support one another, and resist the dehumanizing conditions they faced. Conclusion. The arrival and initial experience in the Americas marked a new chapter of suffering and resilience for enslaved Africans. The disembarkation, inspection, and sale processes were profoundly dehumanizing, stripping individuals of their identities and separating families. The transition to forced labor under brutal conditions further compounded their trauma. Despite these challenges, enslaved Africans demonstrated remarkable resilience, preserving their cultural identities and supporting one another in the face of unimaginable adversity. As we continue to explore the legacy of the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade, it is crucial to recognize the strength and resilience of those who endured these experiences. Their stories are a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure, resist, and ultimately seek freedom. Legacy and impact on African diaspora. The Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade left an indelible mark on the African diaspora, shaping the social, cultural, and economic landscapes of the Americas and beyond. The legacy of this dark chapter in history is multifaceted, encompassing the enduring trauma of slavery, the contributions of African descendants to their new societies, and the ongoing struggle for recognition and justice. This part explores the profound impact of the Middle Passage on the African diaspora and its lasting implications. Enduring trauma and memory. The trauma of the Middle Passage and subsequent enslavement has had a lasting psychological impact on the descendants of those who survived the journey. The experiences of capture, forced migration, and brutal treatment were seared into the collective memory of the African diaspora. This trauma has been passed down through generations, manifesting in various forms of historical and intergenerational trauma. Enslaved Africans carried the emotional scars of their experiences into their new lives in the Americas. The constant threat of violence, the loss of family and community, and the systematic dehumanization they endured left deep emotional wounds. These experiences created a legacy of pain and resilience that has shaped the identities and narratives of their descendants. Cultural survival and transformation. Despite the efforts to suppress African culture, the enslaved found ways to preserve and adapt their traditions. This cultural resilience has had a profound impact on the societies they were forced into. African music, dance, religious practices, and languages blended with those of other cultures to create rich, syncretic traditions that have become integral to the cultural fabric of the Americas. In regions like the Caribbean, Brazil, and the southern United States, African cultural elements are deeply woven into the local traditions. The rhythmic beats of African drums, the call and response patterns in music, and the vibrant dance forms are just a few examples of how African culture has endured and transformed in new environments. These cultural practices have not only survived but have thrived, influencing global music, art, and literature. Economic contributions and exploitation. The labor of enslaved Africans was a cornerstone of the economic development of the Americas. Their forced labor in plantations, mines, and other industries generated immense wealth for European colonizers and American settlers. The profits from slavery fueled the growth of economies and the expansion of empires, contributing significantly to the development of the modern world. However, this economic contribution came at an enormous human cost. The exploitation of African labor under brutal conditions was a fundamental injustice that created profound social and economic disparities. The wealth generated by slavery was concentrated in the hands of a few, while the enslaved and their descendants faced systemic oppression and poverty. Struggle for recognition and justice. The legacy of the Middle Passage is also marked by the ongoing struggle for recognition, justice, and reparations. Descendants of enslaved Africans have fought for the acknowledgement of the atrocities committed during the transatlantic slave trade and the enduring impact of slavery. Movements for civil rights, social justice, and reparations have sought to address the historical injustices and their contemporary consequences. Efforts to commemorate the history of the Middle Passage and honor the resilience of the enslaved have taken many forms. Memorials, museums, and educational programs aim to preserve the memory of this history and ensure that future generations understand its significance. The recognition of the contributions and suffering of enslaved Africans is crucial for fostering a more just and equitable society. Global diaspora and identity. The African diaspora created by the transatlantic slave trade is vast and diverse, encompassing communities across the Americas, Europe, and beyond. The shared history of the Middle Passage has fostered a sense of solidarity and shared identity among these communities. This diasporic identity is characterized by a blend of African heritage and the unique experiences of each community in their new environments. The African diaspora has made significant contributions to global culture, politics, and society. From the Harlem Renaissance to the Brazilian samba, from the fight for civil rights in the United States to the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the descendants of enslaved Africans have played pivotal roles in shaping the modern world. Conclusion. The legacy of the Middle Passage is complex and multifaceted, encompassing enduring trauma, cultural resilience, economic exploitation, and the ongoing struggle for justice. The African diaspora has transformed the horrors of the Middle Passage into a rich tapestry of cultural contributions and a powerful force for social change. As we reflect on this legacy, it is essential to honor the resilience and strength of those who endured the Middle Passage and to continue the fight for recognition, justice, and equality for their descendants. The history of the Middle Passage is not just a story of suffering, but also one of survival, resistance, and enduring human spirit. Educational and commemorative efforts. Recognizing and commemorating the Middle Passage is crucial for understanding its impact and ensuring that the history of this tragic chapter is preserved and respected. Educational and commemorative efforts play a significant role in this process, helping to honor the experiences of those who endured the journey and to foster a deeper understanding of the transatlantic slave trade's legacy. This part explores the various ways in which the Middle Passage has been remembered and taught, highlighting the importance of these efforts in addressing historical injustices and promoting awareness. Educational initiatives. Education is a powerful tool for preserving the memory of the Middle Passage and informing future generations about its significance. Schools, universities, and educational organizations have developed various programs and curricula to teach about the transatlantic slave trade and its consequences. Curriculum development. Many educational institutions have integrated the history of the Middle Passage into their curricula, offering courses and programs that cover the transatlantic slave trade in detail. These courses often include studies on the origins of the slave trade, the conditions of the Middle Passage, the experiences of enslaved Africans, and the legacy of slavery. By providing students with a comprehensive understanding of this history, these programs help to foster awareness and empathy. Educational resources, textbooks, documentaries, and online resources have been created to make the history of the Middle Passage more accessible. These resources provide detailed accounts of the transatlantic slave trade, including personal narratives, historical data, and visual representations. Documentaries such as The Middle Passage and educational websites like the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database offer valuable insights and serve as important tools for both educators and students. School programs and workshops. Some schools and educational organizations offer specialized programs and workshops focused on the Middle Passage. These programs often include interactive activities, guest speakers, and field trips to museums and historical sites. Such hands-on learning experiences can make the history more engaging and memorable for students. Commemorative efforts. Commemorating the Middle Passage is essential for honoring the lives of those who endured the journey and acknowledging the enduring impact of slavery. Various forms of commemoration have been established to remember the suffering and resilience of enslaved Africans. Memorials and monuments. Numerous memorials and monuments have been erected to commemorate the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade. These structures serve as physical reminders of the past and provide spaces for reflection and remembrance. Notable examples include the Cape Coast Castle and Elmina Castle in Ghana, which were significant sites in the slave trade, and the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, England, which highlights the history of the transatlantic slave trade. Museums and cultural centers. Museums and cultural centers dedicated to the history of slavery and the African diaspora play a crucial role in preserving and interpreting the legacy of the Middle Passage. Institutions such as the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., and the Slave Lodge Museum in South Africa offer exhibits and programs that educate the public about the experiences of enslaved Africans and the impact of the transatlantic slave trade. Commemorative events and observances. Various commemorative events and observances are held to honor the memory of those who endured the Middle Passage. These events often include public lectures, cultural performances, and memorial services. International events such as the International Day for the Abolition of Slavery and local observances like Emancipation Day provide opportunities for communities to come together and reflect on the legacy of slavery. Challenges and future directions. Despite these efforts, challenges remain in fully addressing the history and legacy of the Middle Passage. Misconceptions, historical distortions, and lack of resources can hinder educational and commemorative efforts. It is essential to continue advocating for accurate and inclusive historical narratives and to support initiatives that promote understanding and reconciliation. Looking ahead, there is a need for ongoing dialogue and collaboration among educators, historians, and communities to ensure that the history of the Middle Passage is accurately represented and remembered. By continuing to invest in educational and commemorative efforts, society can honor the resilience of those who endured the Middle Passage and work towards a more just and equitable future. Conclusion. Educational and commemorative efforts are vital for preserving the memory of the Middle Passage and acknowledging its impact on the African diaspora. By integrating this history into curricula, creating memorials and museums, and holding commemorative events, society can honor the lives of those who suffered and ensure that their stories are remembered. These efforts not only provide valuable lessons about the past, but also contribute to a greater understanding of the ongoing legacy of slavery and the importance of justice and reconciliation.